The first invitation arrived before sunrise, delivered by a servant who had spent 20 years carrying messages for the oldest families in London and had never once hesitated at the entrance of Blackthorne Manor until that cold winter morning. He remained on the front steps longer than necessary, his gloved hands holding a silver tray as though the single cream-colored envelope resting upon it carried more weight than paper should ever possess. Frost covered the stone lions guarding the estate, and the sea beyond the cliffs disappeared beneath a blanket of pale mist that swallowed the horizon. Inside the manor, the fireplaces had only begun warming the endless corridors when Mrs. Holloway accepted the invitation and noticed the seal pressed into dark blue wax. Ashbourne House. She studied it for a moment before quietly walking toward the breakfast room where Clara sat beside the tall eastern windows, reading while weak sunlight struggled through clouds heavy with snow. The Duchess looked peaceful in the soft morning light, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since cooled. She had begun to love these quiet hours before the household fully awakened. Books did not whisper. Books did not judge. Books never asked why a duke had chosen a woman no one remembered seeing in London society. Mrs. Holloway stopped beside her chair. "A delivery from Ashbourne House, Your Grace." Clara looked up with a gentle smile. "So early?" Mrs. Holloway placed the envelope beside the untouched tea. "It appears to be urgent." Clara thanked her softly before breaking the seal. Her eyes moved slowly across the carefully written lines. "Winter charity reception. Lady Harrington requested the presence of their Graces of Blackthorne for an evening dedicated to widows and orphan children." It seemed harmless until she reached the final sentence. Attendance would be appreciated by all members of London society eager to welcome the Duchess properly. Clara read it twice before quietly folding the paper. Mrs. Holloway remained respectfully silent. "Do you believe they truly wish to welcome me?" Clara finally asked. The older woman hesitated only briefly. "I believe London enjoys watching people more than welcoming them." Clara smiled faintly at the honesty. She slipped the invitation inside the book resting beside her plate and turned toward the snow-covered gardens. The silence that followed should have been comforting. Instead it carried the strange sensation of a storm approaching from somewhere far beyond the sea. Upstairs, Adrian Blackthorne stood inside his study looking over estate accounts spread across an enormous oak desk when another servant entered carrying an identical envelope. The Duke accepted it without expression. His eye scanned the elegant handwriting only once before setting the invitation aside. The servant remained near the doorway. "Will your Grace require a reply?" Adrian looked toward the frost gathering along the window panes. "No." "Very well, Your Grace." The servant bowed slightly before leaving. Adrian remained motionless after the door closed. Ashbourne House rarely organized charity events without another purpose hidden beneath polished manners and expensive crystal chandeliers. Lady Harrington understood society better than most politicians understood Parliament. Nothing she hosted existed without strategy. He reached for the invitation again, noticing the final sentence. "Welcome the Duchess properly." A nearly invisible change crossed his expression. Not irritation. Recognition. Someone intended to place Clara at the center of attention. Someone wanted London looking directly at her. Downstairs, Clara wandered into the library after breakfast hoping the familiar rows of leather-bound volumes would settle the unease slowly growing inside her chest. Dust floated through pale winter sunlight drifting across the shelves. The room smelled of cedar, old paper, and the faint trace of fireplace smoke. She selected a history book almost at random and settled into her favorite chair beside the tall windows overlooking the cliffs. She had barely reached the second chapter when footsteps echoed softly across polished floors. Adrian entered carrying several letters beneath one arm. He noticed her immediately. She noticed him at exactly the same moment. Neither spoke for several seconds. It had become their peculiar language. Silence no longer felt empty when shared between them. Adrian placed the letters upon the long reading table before turning toward the fire. "You received an invitation." Clara nodded once. "So did you?" "Yes." Another quiet pause settled between them. Clara closed her book without looking away from him. Will we attend? Adrian stared into the flames for a moment. No. She blinked softly. That was a quick decision. Lady Harrington does not invite guests without expecting something in return. Clara considered his words. Perhaps she only wishes to introduce me properly. Adrian finally looked toward her. His expression remained calm, but something colder rested beneath it. London already knows your name. Clara lowered her eyes briefly. Knowing a name is not the same as knowing a person. Adrian took a slow breath. Society rarely concerns itself with people. She could not argue with that. She had already learned enough about London to understand curiosity often disguised itself as kindness until the moment someone became vulnerable. Clara stood and crossed the room toward one of the shelves, running her fingers lightly across worn bindings while pretending to search for another book. If we refuse, she said quietly, they will simply create another story. Adrian watched her without answering. If we attend, she continued, perhaps they will discover there is nothing interesting to discuss. A faint change appeared in his eyes. It almost resembled concern. You underestimate how desperately people want mystery. Clara smiled gently without turning around. And perhaps you underestimate how quickly people grow bored. For the first time that morning, something close to amusement touched Adrian's expression before disappearing again. You have more faith in London than I do. No, Clara replied softly. I simply refuse to let strangers decide how much space I occupy. The word settled quietly between them. Adrian studied the woman standing among endless shelves of books, sunlight resting across her dark blue dress while snow drifted beyond the windows. She had arrived at Blackthorne Manor carrying almost nothing except dignity, and somehow that dignity had altered the rhythm of the entire estate. Servants smiled more often. The library remained open later into the evening. Even the empty greenhouse held fresh flowers again. He realized he had begun measuring days by whether he happened to encounter her in passing. The thought unsettled him more than London ever could. Before either of them spoke again, another servant appeared at the doorway. Your Grace. Adrian turned slightly. Yes. There is a messenger waiting outside. He insists the document must be delivered directly into your hands. Adrian nodded once. The servant disappeared and returned carrying a narrow envelope sealed with black wax instead of blue. No family crest appeared upon it. Only a single pressed flower embedded beneath the seal. Clara noticed Adrian become completely still before accepting it. He broke the wax carefully and unfolded the paper inside. Only one sentence had been written across the center in neat deliberate handwriting. Some stories refuse to stay buried. Adrian folded the letter again without visible reaction. Clara watched him quietly. Bad news, she asked. He slipped the message into his coat pocket. An unnecessary attempt at drama. She accepted the answer although something inside her remained unconvinced. The rest of the morning passed beneath an unusual stillness. Snow continued falling beyond the windows until Blackthorne Manor seemed suspended inside endless white silence. Shortly after noon, Mrs. Patterson hurried into the kitchen carrying a London newspaper still damp from melting ice. Servants gathered around as she unfolded the front page. No one noticed Clara approaching from the corridor until she stood beside them. The conversation stopped immediately. Mrs. Patterson looked almost guilty. Clara offered a reassuring smile. Please do not stop because I entered the room. The housekeeper hesitated before handing her the paper. Clara lowered her eyes toward the society column. The headline occupied only one line, but the word somehow felt louder than anything spoken aloud. The new Duchess of Blackthorne finally returns to London. Beneath it stretched paragraphs filled with speculation disguised as polite observation. Some questioned why she had remained hidden for so long. Others wondered whether grief still haunted the halls of Blackthorne Manor. One unnamed source suggested the marriage itself had been born from obligation rather than affection. Clara reached the final sentence and quietly folded the paper. London awaits the truth. Mrs. Patterson watched her carefully. People write foolish things when they have nothing useful to do. Clara looked up and smiled with surprising warmth. Then we should be grateful the kitchens remain busy. A few servants laughed softly, relieved by her calmness. Yet after she left the room, Mrs. Patterson noticed something the Duchess herself probably did not. Clara carried the folded newspaper with both hands as though it had suddenly become heavier than any book she had ever held. Late that afternoon Adrian found her standing alone inside the greenhouse where winter roses struggled against the season. Pale light filtered through frosted glass above them, covering every blossom with silver. Clara stood quietly beside the oldest rosebush, the newspaper resting on a nearby bench. Adrian did not ask whether she had read it. He already knew. She heard his footsteps and looked toward him with the same gentle expression she always carried. London appears disappointed that I exist. Adrian walked closer until only a few feet separated them. London is disappointed whenever reality refuses to resemble gossip. Clara laughed softly, though sadness lingered beneath the sound. Do you ever become tired of people inventing stories about your life? He answered without hesitation. Yes. She lowered her eyes toward the winter roses. I think I am beginning to understand. Neither of them spoke after that. Snow tapped quietly against the greenhouse roof while distant waves crashed below the cliffs. Adrian reached toward one of the frozen branches and carefully brushed away a layer of ice before it could damage a new bud waiting beneath. Clara watched the small gesture in silence. Protection, she realized, did not always arrive through grand declarations. Sometimes it appeared in the patient hands of someone who refused to let delicate things break simply because winter insisted they should. Far beyond Blackthorne Manor, inside the glowing drawing room of Ashbourne House, Lady Harrington accepted a fresh copy of the same newspaper and smiled faintly before placing it beside untouched tea. A guest sitting opposite her glanced toward the headline. Do you believe the Duchess will attend your reception? Lady Harrington looked toward the snow falling beyond tall London windows. She does not need to attend. The woman frowned. Why not? Lady Harrington lifted her cup with perfect composure. Because all of London is already looking at her. Morning arrived beneath a sky so pale that the sea seemed to disappear into it, leaving Blackthorne Manor suspended between earth and cloud as though the estate itself had drifted beyond ordinary time. Clara stood beside the tall window in her chamber with both hands wrapped around a porcelain cup, watching thin snowflakes settle across the gardens where gardeners had carefully covered winter roses with linen cloth before dawn. The silence usually comforted her. That morning it felt different. It carried expectation. Somewhere below, carriage wheels rolled across frozen stone before stopping at the front entrance. She glanced toward the clock. Barely 8. No respectable visitor arrived so early unless necessity had overcome manners. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Holloway entered carrying a polished silver tray upon which rested another envelope unlike any Clara had received before. The paper was plain. The wax seal bore no family crest. Only the faint impression of a pressed white flower. Mrs. Holloway hesitated before placing it upon the small writing desk. The messenger refused to identify himself, Your Grace. Clara looked toward the envelope without moving. Did he leave immediately? Yes. Mrs. Holloway lowered her voice. He appeared anxious to be gone. After the housekeeper quietly departed, Clara crossed the room and picked up the letter. The paper felt unusually thick beneath her fingertips. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded a single sheet containing only 2 lines written in elegant handwriting. You resemble the last woman who believed Blackthorne Manor could protect her. Leave before history remembers another name. Clara remained perfectly still. She read the message again. Then once more. There was no signature. No accusation. Only certainty wrapped in impossible politeness. Outside, a lone crow landed upon the frozen fountain before disappearing into the white morning. Clara folded the paper and slipped it inside her book instead of calling for help. Fear arrived quietly rather than suddenly. It settled inside her chest like cold rain soaking through wool. Downstairs, Adrian stood inside the study reviewing correspondence from estate agents when he heard measured footsteps approaching. He looked up as Clara entered carrying the same blue history book she had held almost every day during the past month. She stopped near the desk and placed the volume gently upon the polished wood. "I received another letter." Adrian's expression did not immediately change. "From whom?" "I do not know." She opened the book and removed the folded page. He read the message only once before the room itself seemed to grow still. Clara noticed the slight tightening of his jaw. Anyone else might have missed it. "This is someone's attempt to create anxiety," Adrian said quietly. "Perhaps." She studied him carefully. "But they knew enough to mention Blackthorne Manor." He folded the letter again with deliberate precision. People enjoy borrowing old ghosts when inventing new stories. Clara rested one hand lightly against the edge of the desk. "Do you truly believe this is nothing?" Adrian looked directly at her. His voice remained calm, yet something beneath it had become impossibly firm. "I believe whoever sent this wants you unsettled. I refuse to assist them." Clara searched his face for several seconds before nodding. She trusted him. At least she wanted to. Yet the words continued echoing inside her mind. "Leave before history remembers another name." Adrian walked toward the fireplace and placed the letter into the flames. Clara watched the edges darken before curling inward. Ink disappeared first. Then paper became ash. "You burned it," she whispered. "Yes." "Why?" He remained focused on the fire. "Because I will not allow anonymous strangers to occupy space inside this house." The answer should have ended the conversation. Instead it created another question neither of them spoke aloud. If the threat meant nothing, why had he destroyed the evidence so quickly? Later that afternoon, Clara wandered through the western gardens wrapped in a dark wool cloak while snow rested lightly upon evergreen hedges trimmed into careful shapes generations before her arrival. Anna, the youngest kitchen maid, hurried toward her carrying a small basket of herbs gathered from the greenhouse. The girl's cheeks had turned bright pink from the cold. "Your Grace." Clara smiled warmly. "You escaped the kitchen." Anna laughed softly. "Only for 10 minutes. Mrs. Patterson says I walk too slowly when I daydream." Clara glanced toward the basket. "Those look beautiful." Anna lowered her voice conspiratorially. "I almost forgot. A gentleman asked me whether you always walk here after luncheon." Clara looked at her with quiet surprise. "Did he?" He was standing near the east gate. The girl frowned slightly while trying to remember. He wore a grey coat and spoke very politely. A faint chill traveled through Clara that had nothing to do with winter. "What did you tell him?" Anna straightened immediately. "Nothing. Mrs. Holloway says we never discuss the family with strangers." Clara reached out and gently adjusted the crooked scarf around the girl's neck. "Mrs. Holloway is very wise." Anna nodded proudly before hurrying back toward the manor. Clara remained beside the frozen path watching her disappear. The estate had always felt isolated from London. Suddenly isolation no longer felt like peace. It felt like distance from help. By evening the snow had stopped, leaving the sky clear enough for stars to appear above the sea cliffs. Adrian entered the library expecting to find empty chairs and quiet fireplaces. Instead he discovered Clara sitting near the tall windows with 3 unopened novels resting beside her. She was not reading. She simply watched darkness settle across the gardens. He approached without disturbing the silence. "Anna told me someone asked about my routine," Clara said before he spoke. Adrian stood beside her chair. "Describe him." "I did not see him." "Did anyone else?" She shook her head. "Only a child carrying herbs." Adrian turned toward the window where moonlight covered every path leading toward the gates. "The guards will be doubled tonight." Clara looked up slowly. "So you do think the letters matter?" He remained silent for a long moment. Finally he answered with quiet honesty. "I think uncertainty deserves caution." She smiled faintly despite everything. That sounds very much like fear wearing a formal coat. Adrian almost smiled in return. Almost. Perhaps. Another silence settled between them. Comfortable despite the conversation. Clara reached toward one of the unopened books before stopping halfway. May I ask you something? Yes. Why do you never tell me everything? Adrian looked at the fire instead of her. Flames reflected softly across polished wooden rows of leather bindings. Because once knowledge exists, it cannot be returned. Clara considered the answer. And because you believe protecting someone means deciding what they should know. He met her eyes then. Sometimes it does. She rose slowly until they stood only a few feet apart. My stepmother once believed the same thing. Adrian listened without interruption. She hid every unpleasant truth until I discovered them alone. Clara's voice remained gentle. It never made the truth kinder. The words lingered between them with surprising weight. Adrian lowered his gaze briefly before speaking. I am trying not to repeat old mistakes. Clara noticed he had not denied making them. Something vulnerable had appeared behind his careful composure. She stepped toward the fireplace and extended her hands toward its warmth. Then perhaps we should both stop pretending silence is always protection. Neither moved after that. Beyond the windows the first stars reflected across the dark sea while the manor settled into familiar evening rhythms. Somewhere a grandfather clock counted another hour. Somewhere servants laughed quietly beyond kitchen doors. Somewhere wind carried the scent of snow through ancient stone corridors. And hidden inside the shadow of an elm tree just beyond the eastern wall, an unseen figure watched the illuminated library window where the Duke and Duchess stood without speaking, folded another sheet of cream paper, and slipped it into a waiting leather satchel before disappearing into the winter night as though Blackthorne Manor itself had whispered permission to leave. The disappearance was discovered just after dawn when Mrs. Patterson entered the herb room expecting to find fresh rosemary hanging beside the windows and instead found an empty apron folded neatly across the work table as though its owner intended to return within minutes. Frost covered the glass, turning the first light of morning into pale silver patterns that reached across stone floors untouched by hurried footsteps. Anna always arrived before anyone else. She always sang quietly while sorting vegetables or polishing copper pots. That silence frightened the kitchen more than any raised voice could have managed. By the time Clara reached the lower corridor, servants stood gathered in uneasy conversation, each speaking softly enough that concern never became panic. Mrs. Holloway approached immediately. Your Grace, Anna has not reported for duty. Clara looked toward the empty herb basket resting near the door. Has anyone searched the grounds? Twice. Clara nodded once and continued toward the kitchen herself. The room still smelled of warm bread and cinnamon despite the tension filling every corner. She noticed Anna's blue scarf hanging carefully beside the pantry entrance. The girl never went outside without it. Clara reached out and touched the soft wool. It remained dry. Whatever had happened, Anna had not walked into the snow that morning. Adrian entered moments later, his dark coat still carrying traces of frozen air from the courtyard. Conversation stopped immediately. He listened without interruption while Mrs. Patterson explained the situation, then asked only one question. When was she last seen? Last evening, Your Grace, the housekeeper answered. She helped prepare supper and carried herbs to the storage room. Adrian glanced toward the corridor leading deeper into the manor. Search every occupied room again. Then search every unused room. One of the older footmen hesitated. Including the west wing. Adrian met his eyes calmly. Especially the west wing. Clara noticed several servants exchange uncertain looks before quietly following orders. The west wing had remained closed for years except for occasional maintenance. Dust and silence had become its permanent residence. She watched Adrian as everyone dispersed. May I help? He considered the question only briefly. Stay with Mrs. Holloway. Clara folded her hands together. That was not my question. For the first time that morning he seemed almost tired. I know. She stepped closer until only the kitchen table separated them. Anna trusts me. Adrian studied her expression before giving a nearly invisible nod. Very well. Half an hour later they stood before the velvet rope that still marked the entrance to the abandoned corridor. Winter light entered through tall windows layered with years of untouched dust. White sheets covered forgotten furniture like sleeping ghosts waiting for spring. Clara remembered the night she had first wandered here following distant piano music. The air carried the same quiet stillness now. Only their footsteps disturbed it. Adrian lifted the rope aside. Remain beside me. Clara answered with a gentle smile. I'm beginning to think you believe I disappear whenever you look away. He almost replied before choosing silence instead. They moved slowly through the corridor, opening room after room. Old sitting parlors. Empty guest chambers. A music room where cracked violin strings rested beneath faded velvet. Nothing suggested recent visitors until Clara stopped beside a narrow window overlooking the cliffs. A thin line crossed the dusty floor in front of an enormous bookcase. She knelt carefully. Someone moved this. Adrian joined her, studying the faint marks left behind. Dust covered everything except a clean strip less than 3 inches wide. He pressed one hand against the carved wood. Nothing happened. Clara looked upward. The upper shelf held dozens of identical leather volumes arranged with impossible precision. One book sat slightly farther forward than the others. She reached for it. Adrian instinctively caught her wrist. His hand relaxed immediately when he realized what he had done. It may be unstable, he said quietly. Clara looked from his hand to his face. Then we should both be careful. She pulled the volume gently. A muted click echoed through the room. The bookcase shifted only a few inches before stopping, revealing a narrow passage hidden inside the stone wall. Cold air drifted outward carrying the scent of cedar and old paper. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally Adrian reached for a lantern resting near the doorway and stepped inside first. The concealed chamber was smaller than Clara expected. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, filled with journals, maps, correspondence, and carefully labeled boxes tied with faded ribbons. A single desk stood beneath a high window where weak sunlight illuminated particles of dust drifting through the air like slow-falling snow. Nothing appeared abandoned. Everything had been preserved with quiet devotion. Clara approached the desk and rested her fingertips upon polished oak. Someone wanted this room remembered. Adrian's gaze moved across the shelves before stopping on one particular collection. Every spine carried the same elegant handwriting. Eleanor. Clara followed his eyes. Her pulse slowed instead of quickening. She had imagined secrets hidden in darkness. She had not imagined an entire life arranged with meticulous care. Adrian removed one journal and opened it carefully. Several pages had been filled with botanical sketches and pressed flowers. Others contained notes about music, charity visits, and recipes gathered from village women living near the coast. Clara read a single sentence written beneath a watercolor rose. Beauty survives longest when nobody demands it prove its worth. She looked toward Adrian. This does not sound like the woman London describes. His expression remained unreadable. No. He continued turning pages until he reached the center of the journal. The paper changed suddenly. Instead of handwriting, only rough edges remained. Someone had removed an entire section. Clara counted the torn pages silently. At least 20. Adrian closed the journal with unusual care. They are missing. Who would take them? He did not answer immediately. Instead he examined the shelves one by one until he noticed another gap where a matching volume should have rested. Dust outlined the shape of a missing book with unsettling clarity. Someone had visited recently. Clara walked toward the narrow window and looked outside. Snow covered the gardens below in perfect white except for one faint line disappearing toward the eastern wall where bare trees met frozen cliffs. It could have been wind. It could have been footprints nearly erased overnight. Adrian. He joined her. She pointed silently toward the distant mark. He followed her gaze before looking back at the hidden room surrounding them. The passage is known to someone else. Clara lowered her voice. Someone who knew exactly what to remove. They searched for another hour without discovering Anna or any explanation for her absence. Yet Clara found something else tucked carefully inside a small wooden box beneath the desk. A pressed white flower identical to the seal that had appeared on every anonymous letter. Beside it rested a folded scrap of cream paper no larger than a calling card. She unfolded it slowly. Only 2 words had been written across the center in graceful script. Trust nobody. Adrian read the message over her shoulder. Neither noticed how close they stood until the silence itself became almost tangible. Clara looked toward the rows of journals surrounding them. Do you think Eleanor wrote this? Adrian stared at the white flower resting against faded cedar. I think someone wants us to believe she did. Before either of them could say more, hurried footsteps echoed from beyond the hidden passage. Mrs. Holloway appeared at the entrance holding her skirts above the dusty floor, her normally composed expression touched by unmistakable relief. Your Grace. She paused, catching her breath. Anna has returned. Clara stepped forward immediately. Is she safe? Mrs. Holloway nodded. She is frightened, but unharmed. Adrian's voice remained calm. Where was she? The housekeeper looked from him to the hidden shelves surrounding them before answering quietly. She says a kind older lady asked her to deliver a basket to the village chapel yesterday evening. When she arrived, the chapel was empty except for an envelope addressed to the Duchess of Blackthorne. Clara felt her fingers tighten around the tiny note still resting in her hand. Mrs. Holloway continued softly. Anna never opened it. She fell asleep at the caretaker's cottage after the snow became too heavy to travel. She has only just returned. Adrian remained perfectly still. Where is the envelope now? Mrs. Holloway swallowed gently. It bears the seal of Lady Harrington. The envelope remained unopened until evening, resting upon the long mahogany table inside the library where firelight painted slow golden patterns across polished wooden rows of ancient books. Outside, fresh snow drifted over Blackthorne Manor with such quiet determination that every path leading toward the gates gradually disappeared beneath white silence. Clara stood near the fireplace with Anna beside her, the young maid wrapped in a warm wool blanket while Mrs. Holloway poured tea no one seemed interested in drinking. Adrian entered carrying the day's London newspapers folded beneath one arm. He placed them beside the envelope without speaking. Clara noticed the unusual tension in his posture before she noticed the headlines themselves. The largest society column occupied nearly half the front page. The new Duchess of Blackthorne declines every invitation while old questions refuse to rest. Smaller paragraphs stretched beneath the title, elegant words disguising sharp speculation. Some claimed the Duchess feared public appearances. Others suggested she remained hidden because Blackthorne Manor still carried memories unsuitable for polite society. One anonymous source insisted the marriage itself had been arranged to erase an inconvenient past rather than begin a hopeful future. Clara read every line with remarkable calm. She folded the paper and returned it to the table exactly as she had found it. Mrs. Holloway watched carefully. You need not read such foolishness, Your Grace. Clara offered a gentle smile. If people are speaking, pretending not to hear them will not make them quieter. Adrian reached for the unopened envelope instead. The seal of Lady Harrington remained perfectly intact. He broke it without hesitation and unfolded a single sheet of cream paper. His expression did not visibly change, but Clara noticed his eyes remain fixed upon one sentence longer than the others. What does she want? Adrian handed the letter to Clara. The handwriting flowed with effortless elegance. Lady Harrington expressed concern regarding unpleasant rumors and extended another invitation to the winter charity reception, assuring the Duchess that attendance would silence unnecessary speculation and restore confidence throughout London society. At the bottom appeared one additional line written separately from the rest. Some women survive gossip. Others become history because they underestimate it. Clara lowered the page slowly. She writes as though she is warning me. Adrian looked toward the fire. Lady Harrington never wastes words. Anna shifted nervously beneath her blanket. Your Grace, I did not know the envelope came from her. I promise I never opened it. Clara crossed the room and gently squeezed the girl's hand. I know. Anna looked down. The older lady who asked me to carry the basket said kindness should always be delivered personally. Clara exchanged a quiet glance with Adrian. Can you describe her? The girl closed her eyes while trying to remember. She was elegant. Very calm. She wore dark blue gloves and smelled like winter roses. Adrian remained completely still. Mrs. Holloway quietly dismissed Anna and closed the library doors after her, leaving only silence, firelight, and snow pressing softly against tall windows. Clara walked toward one of the shelves and rested her fingertips upon familiar leather bindings. Do you know anyone who wears winter rose perfume? Adrian answered almost immediately. Eleanor. The room seemed to grow quieter than before. Clara turned slowly. Are you certain? He nodded once. She had it specially prepared every winter. Clara looked toward the flames reflecting across the windows. Somewhere beyond those walls, someone had deliberately chosen the same scent years later. Whether as memory or manipulation, she could not yet decide. The following afternoon the carriage from London arrived carrying fresh newspapers and several additional invitations from families suddenly eager to welcome the Duchess of Blackthorne into society. Mrs. Patterson collected them with visible suspicion before delivering everything to the morning room where Clara sat embroidering a linen handkerchief she knew she would probably never finish. The first invitation praised her grace. The second admired her charitable reputation despite never having met her. The third politely wondered whether she might attend the upcoming reception alongside her husband. Clara set them aside one by one until only another newspaper remained. This edition contained a sketch instead of a headline. The artist had attempted to recreate the unknown Duchess from rumor alone. The drawing resembled no one Clara recognized. The woman appeared proud, distant, almost severe. Beneath it ran a single sentence. The silent Duchess continues to hide at Blackthorne Manor. Clara studied the unfamiliar face before laughing softly to herself. Mrs. Patterson looked almost alarmed. Your Grace? Clara held up the newspaper. Apparently I have become someone else. The housekeeper frowned. People who have never met you should not be permitted pencils. Even Clara smiled more openly at that. Their brief peace lasted only minutes before another servant entered carrying a polished silver tray. A messenger from Ashbourne House, Your Grace. This time no envelope rested upon the tray. Instead there was a small velvet box no larger than a lady's glove. Clara opened it carefully. Inside lay a white silk ribbon tied around a pressed winter rose. Beneath it rested a handwritten note. Wear white. London remembers innocence more kindly than truth. Clara closed the box without speaking. Mrs. Patterson crossed herself quietly before excusing herself from the room. News travelled through servants' corridors faster than wind travelled across open fields. By supper every maid and footman in Blackthorne Manor knew anonymous gifts had begun arriving for their Duchess. No one spoke of fear. They simply moved closer whenever Clara entered a room, as though ordinary companionship could become its own form of protection. That evening Adrian found her alone inside the greenhouse where lanterns cast warm circles of light across sleeping flowers. Snow rested upon the glass roof, softening the world beyond into pale shadows. Clara stood beside the oldest rosebush, the unopened velvet box resting upon the stone bench beside her. Adrian picked it up and studied the ribbon. You should not keep these. Clara looked toward the winter roses instead of him. Neither should we destroy every question before understanding it. He remained silent. She finally turned to face him. Someone wants me frightened. Yes. Someone wants me hidden. Yes. And someone keeps reminding me of Eleanor. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly. Yes. Clara stepped closer until only inches separated them. She spoke quietly, yet every word carried unmistakable certainty. "Then I will attend Lady Harrington's reception." Adrian looked at her immediately. "No. If I stay here, London will continue inventing a woman who does not exist. You owe London nothing." Clara smiled with gentle sadness. "Perhaps not. But I owe myself the chance to walk into a room without apologizing for being there." The fire lantern beside them flickered as wind brushed against the greenhouse walls. Adrian studied her face for a long moment before speaking again. "They will watch every step. Let them. They will judge every word. Then I will choose my words carefully. They will compare you to Eleanor." Clara reached toward the frozen branch between them and carefully brushed away a layer of snow until a tiny unopened bud appeared beneath it. Flowers do not stop blooming because someone remembers last winter. Adrian followed the movement of her hand instead of answering. For the first time since the anonymous letters had begun, he understood something that surprised even him. Clara was no longer the person he feared London might break. She had quietly become the person who refused to let London decide who deserved to bloom. He took the white ribbon from the velvet box, folded it once, and placed it into the lantern flame until silk curled gently into ash. Then he looked back at Clara with the calm certainty that always seemed strongest when spoken softly. "If you are going to London," he said, "I'm going with you." Far away inside Ashbourne House, Lady Harrington stood before a ballroom already being prepared with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and arrangements of white winter roses placed at exact intervals along the walls. A young companion approached carrying a guest list nearly complete. "Will the Duchess attend?" Lady Harrington accepted the parchment and smiled with quiet confidence. "She will." The companion looked surprised. "How can you be so certain?" Lady Harrington reached toward a single white rose resting upon the grand piano and adjusted one delicate petal. "Because women who have spent too long invisible eventually stop hiding." The journey to London began beneath a sky washed in pearl grey, where the rising sun struggled through winter clouds and turned the frozen countryside into fields of quiet silver. Blackthorne Manor stood behind them as the carriage rolled through iron gates that had remained closed to society for far too long, its stone towers fading into the morning mist until only memory seemed capable of finding them again. Clara sat opposite Adrian with gloved hands resting calmly in her lap while the steady rhythm of the wheels echoed beneath polished wood. She had imagined this moment many times during sleepless nights, yet none of those imagined versions carried the unexpected stillness that surrounded them now. Adrian watched the passing landscape before finally breaking the silence. "You can still change your mind." Clara turned toward the narrow window where bare trees stretched across white fields like careful sketches against the pale horizon. "Can I?" He answered honestly. "Yes." She smiled gently without looking back. "Then I choose not to." His gaze remained on her for a moment longer before returning to the road ahead. There was nothing left to argue. He had learned that Clara's quiet decisions possessed a strength louder people rarely understood. By late afternoon London emerged through drifting fog, its broad avenues alive with elegant carriages, polished storefronts, and gentlemen walking beneath dark umbrellas despite the absence of rain. Smoke curled above rooftops while hundreds of windows reflected fading daylight until the city appeared covered in scattered stars before evening had fully arrived. Clara felt familiar tension settle quietly inside her chest as Ashbourne House came into view. Marble steps stretched toward enormous oak doors framed by columns wrapped in white winter roses. Lanterns glowed warmly beneath crystal glass, welcoming guests with effortless confidence. Footmen hurried forward the moment the Blackthorne carriage stopped. One servant opened the door with perfect formality. "Their Graces of Blackthorne." The announcement carried across the entrance hall before Clara had even stepped onto polished stone. Conversation slowed almost immediately. She felt a tension move through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Not hostile. Not kind. Simply unavoidable. Adrian descended first before extending one gloved hand toward her without ceremony. Clara accepted it naturally. The contact lasted only seconds, yet whispers had already begun traveling through nearby guests. Lady Harrington approached with practiced elegance, dressed in deep emerald silk that contrasted sharply against the white flowers decorating every column. Her smile appeared flawless enough to belong inside a portrait. "Your Grace." She inclined her head toward Adrian before turning to Clara. "The evening is brighter for your presence." Clara returned the courtesy with calm warmth. "You are generous to say so." Lady Harrington's eyes lingered just long enough to suggest careful observation. "London has waited with remarkable patience." Adrian answered before Clara could respond. "London has many unnecessary hobbies." A few guests standing nearby lowered their eyes to hide faint smiles. Lady Harrington remained perfectly composed. "Curiosity is difficult to discourage." Adrian looked toward the ballroom beyond her shoulder. "So is gossip." Silence hovered for a heartbeat before Lady Harrington gracefully stepped aside. "Please enjoy the reception." Clara entered the ballroom beside Adrian and immediately understood why Ashbourne House had become famous throughout society. Crystal chandeliers reflected thousands of points of light across polished marble floors while musicians performed from a raised gallery hidden behind arrangements of evergreen branches and white roses. Long tables displayed porcelain, silver, and winter fruit arranged with impossible precision. Every conversation seemed measured. Every smile seemed rehearsed. Clara also noticed something else. Every person who glanced toward her eventually looked toward Adrian instead. The Duke carried authority so naturally that rooms adjusted themselves around him without invitation. A young countess whispered something behind a lace fan while studying Clara's dark blue gown. Another lady answered quietly enough that only fragments reached her. "Not what I expected." "She looks ordinary." Clara almost laughed at the word. Ordinary had once frightened her. Now it felt strangely comforting. Mrs. Holloway had insisted upon simplicity. No diamonds beyond family tradition. No extravagant embroidery. No attempt to compete with women who had spent entire seasons preparing for evenings exactly like this one. She belonged to herself rather than to spectacle. A gentleman in his 60s approached carrying a crystal glass. Silver hair framed an observant face marked by years rather than vanity. He bowed respectfully. "Your Grace." Adrian recognized him immediately. "Lord Ashford." The older man smiled before turning toward Clara. "I have wanted to meet the lady responsible for reopening the Blackthorne greenhouse." Clara blinked with surprise. "You know about the roses. My late wife adored them." His expression softened beneath memory. "Your gardener sent cuttings to the village hospital last week. They brightened many difficult rooms." Clara glanced briefly toward Adrian. She had never mentioned the deliveries outside the estate. Lord Ashford noticed the exchange and smiled knowingly. Kindness travels faster than rumor. It simply arrives more quietly. Before Clara could answer, movement near the grand staircase shifted the atmosphere of the entire ballroom. An elderly woman dressed in understated black descended slowly with the assistance of a polished cane. She carried no jewels beyond a single pearl brooch shaped like a lily. Yet conversations faded one by one until only music remained. Lady Harrington herself walked forward to greet her. Guests bowed with unmistakable respect. Clara leaned slightly toward Adrian. "Who is she?" His voice lowered almost imperceptibly. "Lady Beatrice Somerville." "I have never heard the name." "Most people have." Clara followed the older woman's progress across the ballroom. "Then why does everyone stop speaking?" Adrian watched carefully. Because when Lady Beatrice chooses to attend an event, it is usually because she remembers something everyone else wishes forgotten. The observation settled quietly inside Clara's thoughts. Lady Beatrice accepted greetings without lingering until her eyes moved across the room and stopped unexpectedly upon Clara. Time seemed to narrow into a single silent moment. The elderly woman studied her with remarkable attention before changing direction entirely. Guests instinctively stepped aside. Lady Harrington's pleasant expression became almost unreadable. Clara remained still as Lady Beatrice approached. "You must be the Duchess of Blackthorne." Her voice carried gentle strength untouched by age. Clara inclined her head. "It is an honor to meet you." Lady Beatrice looked at her for another long second before smiling with genuine warmth. "No." She reached into the small reticule hanging from her wrist and withdrew a folded ivory handkerchief embroidered with tiny winter roses. "The honor belongs to old women who live long enough to witness history repeating itself." Clara accepted the handkerchief carefully. "I am afraid I do not understand." Lady Beatrice's gaze shifted briefly toward Adrian before returning to Clara. Neither did Eleanor. Every nearby conversation seemed to disappear at once. Clara felt Adrian become perfectly still beside her. Lady Beatrice continued as though she had merely commented on the weather. "You have the same habit." Clara lowered her eyes toward the embroidered roses. "What habit?" The older woman smiled sadly. "You both look at people as though they deserve to be understood before they are judged." No one spoke. Even the musician seemed quieter than before. Lady Beatrice reached out and gently adjusted one fold of Clara's sleeve with grandmotherly care. "Protect that kindness, child. London mistakes it for weakness." She turned to leave, taking only a few measured steps before pausing one final time. Without looking back, she added softly, "And if you truly wish to know who Eleanor Blackthorne was, stop listening to the people who survived her." Then she continued across the ballroom, leaving behind complete silence, a linen handkerchief stitched with winter roses, and a room full of aristocrats suddenly watching Clara not with curiosity alone but with something far more unsettling. Recognition. The music resumed only after Lady Beatrice disappeared into the sea of polished marble and candlelight, yet something inside the ballroom had already shifted beyond repair. Conversations returned in careful whispers instead of easy laughter. Crystal glasses touched with restrained elegance. Every glance that drifted toward Clara carried new meaning, as though the unknown Duchess had suddenly become part of a story older than anyone had expected. She remained standing beside Adrian with the embroidered handkerchief resting lightly between her fingers, its tiny winter roses almost identical to the pressed flowers that had arrived inside anonymous letters at Blackthorne Manor. "Do you know what she meant?" Clara asked quietly without looking away from the crowd. Adrian answered after a long pause. "Lady Beatrice rarely explains herself." Clara lowered her eyes toward the white linen. "That was not my question." He studied the delicate stitching before speaking again. "No. I do not know." It was the first time she had heard uncertainty in his voice. Not hesitation. Not restraint. Genuine uncertainty. Somehow that unsettled her more than any rumor written in London's newspapers. A servant approached carrying a silver tray filled with crystal glasses sparkling beneath hundreds of candles. Clara accepted one out of courtesy but never tasted the cider. Across the ballroom she noticed Lady Harrington smiling graciously while greeting newly arrived guests, yet the woman's attention returned to Clara with remarkable frequency. Not openly. Never long enough to appear impolite. Just enough to suggest careful observation. Lord Ashford joined them again, his gentle expression untouched by society's shifting currents. "Lady Beatrice does enjoy changing the direction of an evening," he remarked softly. Adrian inclined his head. "She succeeds more often than most politicians." The older gentleman smiled faintly before turning toward Clara. "Do not mistake silence for hostility tonight, Your Grace. Many people are thinking rather than judging." Clara answered with quiet honesty. "I am beginning to suspect thinking may frighten London more than gossip." Lord Ashford laughed, the warm sound drawing curious glances from nearby guests. "Your husband chose well." The sentence arrived so naturally that Clara did not immediately react. Adrian did. His gaze shifted toward the older man for the briefest moment before returning to the ballroom. Nothing more was said, yet Clara felt unexpected warmth settle quietly inside her chest. Before conversation could continue, musicians changed melodies and the first couple stepped gracefully onto the dance floor beneath crystal chandeliers reflecting endless circles of light. Lady Harrington approached once more with perfect timing. The evening would be honored if the Duke and Duchess opened the next dance. Clara sensed a tension gathering around them almost immediately. She looked toward Adrian without expectation. He had attended countless formal occasions throughout his life. She had spent most of hers watching from the edges of rooms where no one invited invisible girls to dance. Adrian remained silent long enough for whispers to begin spreading again. Then he offered one gloved hand toward Clara. "If you wish." The words carried no obligation. Only choice. Clara placed her hand in his. "I do." Together they stepped onto polished marble while conversations faded into respectful quiet. The orchestra began a slow winter waltz filled with gentle strings and restrained elegance. Adrian guided her into the first movement with practiced confidence, one hand resting lightly against hers while the other remained carefully positioned at a proper distance. Nothing about the dance invited scandal. Everything about it invited attention. Clara discovered almost immediately that he moved with remarkable precision, anticipating each turn before music required it. "You dance well," she said softly. His expression remained calm. "I was trained." She smiled. "That sounds less romantic than I expected." A nearly invisible hint of amusement appeared in his eyes. "Most aristocratic education is." They turned beneath the chandeliers while white roses framed the ballroom like winter gardens brought indoors. Clara became aware of countless eyes following every step. Surprisingly, the awareness no longer frightened her. Adrian's quiet certainty seemed to create invisible space around them where whispers could exist without reaching her. Halfway through the dance she noticed movement near the musicians' gallery. Lady Beatrice stood alone beneath a marble archway speaking with a gentleman Clara did not recognize. He appeared elderly, dressed entirely in charcoal grey, his silver hair carefully combed back from a thoughtful face. While listening, he removed something from an inside pocket and handed it discreetly to Lady Beatrice. A journal. Dark blue leather worn gently by time. Clara's breath slowed. The cover matched the missing volumes hidden inside Blackthorne Manor's secret room. She watched Lady Beatrice glance briefly across the ballroom before tucking the journal beneath her shawl. "Adrian." He followed her gaze without interrupting the dance. The elderly gentleman had already disappeared into the crowd. Lady Beatrice remained alone. "Did you see that?" Clara whispered. "Yes." "The journal?" "Yes." She hesitated before asking the question forming quietly inside her thoughts. "Should we speak with her?" Adrian looked toward the musicians as the melody approached its final movement. "Not here." The dance ended beneath gentle applause. Clara expected Lady Beatrice to remain where she had been standing only moments earlier. Instead the archway stood empty. She and Adrian crossed the ballroom with calm urgency, careful never to attract unnecessary attention. The corridor beyond the musicians' gallery stretched toward a series of private drawing rooms lined with portraits of long-forgotten families. Every door stood open except one. Soft firelight escaped beneath it. Adrian knocked once. A familiar voice answered almost immediately. "Please come in." Lady Beatrice sat beside the fireplace exactly as though she had been expecting them. The dark blue journal rested upon a small table beside untouched tea. She looked first at Clara, then at Adrian, and smiled with surprising kindness. "You dance beautifully." Clara stepped closer before curiosity could lose courage. "Someone gave you that journal?" Lady Beatrice glanced toward the leather volume. "Someone did." "May I ask who?" The older woman folded her hands peacefully. "A man who has spent 10 years regretting his silence." Adrian remained motionless near the doorway. "And what does he believe this journal contains?" Lady Beatrice looked directly at him. The truth Eleanor tried very hard to preserve. Silence settled over the room while firelight flickered gently across polished wood. Clara approached the table but stopped herself from touching the journal. If this is truly hers, why has no one seen it before? Lady Beatrice's expression softened with quiet sadness. Because London prefers stories that flatter its assumptions. She reached for the worn leather cover and opened the first page. Inside rested careful handwriting beneath a pressed white winter rose. Eleanor Blackthorne. Private Reflections. Clara felt her pulse shift. Lady Beatrice slowly turned several pages filled with botanical sketches, music notes, and observations about village families until she reached the center. There she stopped. Entire sections had been removed with deliberate precision. Torn edges remained where pages should have been. Adrian stepped forward at last. The missing pages. Lady Beatrice nodded. Someone found this journal before you did. Clara stared at the empty spaces left behind. Do you know who? The older woman closed the book gently. No. Her eyes lifted toward Clara with quiet intensity. But I know why. Neither Clara nor Adrian spoke. Lady Beatrice rested one hand upon the worn leather cover and answered the question already hanging between them. Because the missing pages are the only place where Eleanor ever wrote the name Lady Harrington. Lady Beatrice did not speak again until the fire settled into quiet embers and the distant orchestra resumed another elegant melody beyond the closed drawing-room doors. The silence felt intentional rather than uncomfortable, giving every word already spoken enough space to become heavier. Clara stood beside the small table with her eyes resting on the weathered journal while Adrian remained near the fireplace, one hand lightly touching the carved mantel as though steadying himself against memories no one else could see. Finally Lady Beatrice opened the journal once more and carefully turned several pages that had survived untouched. Delicate sketches of winter roses appeared beside handwritten observations written in graceful flowing script. Eleanor had described village children feeding birds during the first snowfall. She had recorded the exact shade of the sea outside Blackthorne Manor at sunrise. She had even listed the names of gardeners who preferred planting herbs beside flowers because they believed kindness grew better when usefulness accompanied beauty. Clara smiled almost without realizing it. She noticed everything. Lady Beatrice looked toward her with quiet approval. Very few people notice the world after they become wealthy. Eleanor never stopped. Adrian crossed the room slowly. His gaze remained fixed upon the familiar handwriting. She never showed me these journals. Lady Beatrice closed the book gently. She believed private thoughts deserved one place untouched by expectation. Clara looked from the journal to Adrian. She had spent weeks hearing London describe Eleanor as mystery, tragedy, rumor, and shadow. Yet every surviving page revealed someone astonishingly ordinary in the best possible way. A woman who collected pressed flowers. A woman who remembered servants by name. A woman who worried about lonely widows living near the cliffs. None of it resembled the legend surrounding Blackthorne Manor. People become stories very quickly, Clara whispered. Lady Beatrice nodded. Especially women. Another knock interrupted the quiet conversation. A young servant entered carrying a polished silver tray. Your Grace, Lady Harrington requests the honor of speaking with the Duke before supper is served. Adrian accepted the message without expression. Tell Lady Harrington I will join the guests shortly. The servant bowed and disappeared. Lady Beatrice waited until the door closed before speaking again. She knows I have the journal. Adrian looked toward the hallway. How? The older woman smiled faintly. People who spend their lives arranging society also spend their lives collecting information. Clara rested one hand upon the back of a nearby chair. Then she already knows we are asking questions. Yes. Should we be concerned? Lady Beatrice reached for her teacup, although it had long since grown cold. Concern is useful. Fear rarely is. Adrian remained thoughtful for several moments before quietly asking the question Clara herself had been considering. Who gave you the journal? Lady Beatrice looked into the fire instead of at either of them. Thomas Ellsworth. Adrian's expression changed almost imperceptibly. The former steward. Yes. Clara searched her memory. She had never heard the name spoken inside Blackthorne Manor. Lady Beatrice noticed her confusion. He served the estate for nearly 30 years before retiring to the coast. Adrian frowned slightly. He left without explanation. No. Lady Beatrice's voice carried gentle certainty. He left because he believed remaining would place others in unnecessary difficulty. Clara stepped closer. Is he still alive? Lady Beatrice nodded. He is 80 years old and grows roses overlooking the sea. Something warm settled quietly inside Clara's thoughts. Then perhaps we should speak with him. Adrian looked toward her immediately. It is not that simple. Why? He hesitated. Because if Thomas chose silence for 10 years, he must have believed someone still benefited from it. Lady Beatrice carefully removed a folded page tucked inside the back cover of the journal and handed it to Clara. Unlike the elegant entries filling earlier pages, this note contained only one sentence written in noticeably hurried handwriting. If truth ever becomes dangerous, trust the gardeners before the guests. Clara read the line twice. What does it mean? Lady Beatrice smiled softly. Eleanor believed flowers revealed character better than conversation. Adrian took the note and studied the uneven ink. This was written near the end. Yes. How do you know? Lady Beatrice pointed toward the lower corner where the date remained visible beneath faded ink. 3 days before Eleanor's final illness. Silence returned once more. The orchestra beyond the walls began another waltz while laughter drifted faintly through the corridors of Ashbourne House. Inside the drawing room no one seemed eager to return to celebration. Clara walked toward the tall window overlooking snow-covered gardens illuminated by lanterns placed along winding paths. Guests wandered slowly between hedges trimmed into graceful shapes, their voices blending with distant music until the evening resembled a peaceful painting rather than a gathering filled with suspicion. Her attention stopped upon 2 figures standing near a marble fountain. Lady Harrington spoke quietly with a gardener wearing the estate's dark green uniform. The exchange lasted only seconds. The gardener accepted something small enough to disappear into his pocket before bowing respectfully and walking away through the maze of white roses. Clara watched carefully. Adrian. He joined her beside the window. She nodded toward the garden below. Do you know that man? Adrian studied the retreating figure. No. Lady Beatrice moved beside them. Her eyes narrowed only slightly. That is unusual. Clara glanced toward her. Why? Ashbourne House employs the same head gardener every winter. They continued watching until the man disappeared behind evergreen hedges. Lady Harrington remained alone for a moment before looking unexpectedly toward the drawing-room window. Even across the distance Clara felt the unmistakable sensation of being observed. Lady Harrington smiled politely and inclined her head with perfect social grace before rejoining the guests as though nothing unusual had happened. Clara stepped away from the glass. She wanted us to see her. Adrian folded the note from Eleanor and slipped it carefully inside his coat. Yes. But why? Lady Beatrice answered with quiet certainty. Because people who feel confident rarely hide. A bell echoed through Ashbourne House announcing supper. Servants opened double doors leading toward the grand dining hall where hundreds of candles transformed crystal and silver into rivers of warm light. Guests began moving gracefully through the corridors, conversations flowing once more toward fashion, estates, and politics as though old journals and missing pages had never existed. Clara expected Adrian to offer his arm automatically. Instead he paused beside her, giving her the same simple choice he had offered before the dance. She accepted without hesitation. They entered the dining hall together beneath portraits of forgotten dukes whose painted expressions seemed permanently untouched by gossip or grief. Their places had been arranged near the center of the long table directly opposite Lady Harrington. Clara noticed the deliberate seating immediately. So did Adrian. Lady Harrington greeted them with flawless composure. Your Grace, I hope you are enjoying the evening. Clara returned the smile with equal calm. More than I expected. London can be surprising. So can silence. Something unreadable flickered briefly behind Lady Harrington's eyes before disappearing beneath practiced elegance. The first course arrived. Crystal reflected candlelight across polished silver. Conversations rose gently around the table. Clara reached for her water glass when a folded cream card slipped unnoticed from beneath her napkin and settled quietly beside her plate. No one else seemed to see it. She unfolded the paper beneath the table with careful fingers. Only 6 words appeared in graceful, familiar handwriting. The gardener remembers what the journal cannot. Clara slowly lifted her eyes toward the far end of the dining hall where tall windows overlooked the dark winter gardens. Standing beyond the glass beneath falling snow, almost hidden by rows of white roses, the same unknown gardener looked directly at her for one silent heartbeat before turning and disappearing into the night. Snow continued falling long after supper ended, covering the gardens of Ashbourne House in a quiet white veil that softened every path and every carefully trimmed hedge until the estate resembled a dream painted beneath hundreds of lanterns. Inside the ballroom the orchestra welcomed another round of dancers, yet Clara could no longer hear the music with the same ease. The folded cream card remained hidden inside her glove, and the 6 handwritten words repeated themselves with calm persistence. The gardener remembers what the journal cannot. She looked once more toward the tall windows. The unknown gardener had vanished, leaving behind only untouched snow reflecting the glow of crystal chandeliers. Adrian noticed the subtle change in her expression before she spoke. Something happened. Clara waited until nearby conversations drifted farther away. She quietly removed the folded card and placed it into his hand beneath the edge of the table. His eyes moved across the message without visible reaction, but his fingers closed around the paper almost immediately. "We are leaving," he said softly. Clara looked toward the ballroom where guests laughed beneath warm light and white roses. Now. Now. Before either of them stood, Lady Beatrice approached carrying her cane with graceful confidence. She seemed unsurprised by the decision already forming between them. "You have seen something." Adrian inclined his head slightly. "Enough to shorten our evening." Lady Beatrice studied Clara for a moment before reaching into the pocket of her dark shawl and removing a small silver key attached to a faded blue ribbon. She placed it gently into Clara's hand. "If you return to Blackthorne Manor tonight, open the cedar cabinet inside the greenhouse." Clara looked down at the worn key. "Why give this to me?" The older woman's smile carried quiet affection. "Because Eleanor trusted flowers more than locked doors." She turned away before another question could follow, disappearing once again into elegant society as naturally as snowfall disappeared into winter fields. The Blackthorne carriage departed less than 20 minutes later. London faded behind them beneath pale moonlight while frozen streets stretched toward open countryside. Clara sat beside the window with the silver key resting inside her palm. Adrian unfolded the anonymous card once more beneath the small carriage lantern. "The handwriting matches the previous letters," he said quietly. Clara nodded. "Do you think the gardener left it?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone wanted us to believe he did." Adrian looked toward her. "You are beginning to think like Eleanor." Clara smiled faintly. "I never met her." "No." His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "But you notice what others ignore." The carriage continued through silent roads lined with snow-covered trees. Hours passed peacefully until they reached the narrow stone bridge crossing Blackthorne Creek, less than 2 miles from the manor. The driver gently slowed the horses. One of the stable lamps mounted near the front suddenly flickered before fading into darkness. The carriage rolled to a careful stop. Clara glanced toward Adrian. "What happened?" Before he could answer, the coachman called respectfully through the window. "Your Grace, one of the harness straps has slipped. I believe the cold loosened the leather." Adrian opened the carriage door and stepped onto the packed snow. Clara watched through the glass as he inspected the horses beneath bright moonlight. The animals stood calmly, their breath rising in soft clouds against the winter air. Nothing appeared hurried. Nothing appeared dangerous. Even so, Adrian looked back toward the carriage after only a few moments. "Remain inside." Clara almost laughed. "I always do." His expression softened briefly before he turned toward the front wheel. She waited quietly, listening to the muffled sounds of leather being adjusted and gentle voices calming the horses. Her attention drifted toward the surrounding fields where moonlight covered untouched snow in endless silver. Then she noticed something unusual. A narrow trail of footprints crossed the frozen meadow parallel to the road before disappearing behind a cluster of old oak trees. They looked fresh. Deliberate. Someone had walked there recently despite the late hour and heavy snow. Clara reached instinctively toward the carriage window and traced the path with her eyes. A small shape rested near the final footprint, almost completely hidden beneath white powder. It reflected moonlight for a single instant. Curiosity quietly overcame hesitation. She opened the carriage door and stepped carefully onto the snow, wrapping her cloak more tightly against the cold. Adrian heard the movement immediately. "Clara!" She looked toward him. "There is something over there." He followed her gaze and walked beside her without argument. Together they crossed the shallow field until Clara knelt beside the object nearly buried beneath fresh snow. It was not jewelry or polished silver as she had expected. It was a tiny ceramic flower pot no larger than 2 hands, containing a single winter rose still somehow blooming despite the freezing night. A folded note rested beneath the ribbon tied around the stem. Clara lifted it gently. The paper remained perfectly dry as though someone had placed it there only minutes earlier. She unfolded the message while Adrian stood quietly beside her. The handwriting appeared familiar again. "Flowers survive because they bend before storms. Trust the greenhouse." Clara looked at the impossible rose glowing softly beneath moonlight. "Someone knew we would stop here." Adrian accepted the flower pot carefully and examined the base. A small mark had been painted beneath the ceramic. A simple letter E. Neither spoke for several moments. The wind carried only the distant sound of water flowing beneath the frozen bridge. Finally Adrian looked toward the road. "We should return." Clara nodded and rose, but before taking her first step she noticed another detail hidden beneath fresh snow. A line carved carefully into the stone marker standing beside the bridge. Time had nearly erased it. She brushed away the remaining frost with her glove until faded letters became visible. Eleanor Blackthorne Memorial Garden Project. Dedicated with gratitude to the village children. Clara stared quietly at the inscription. There was a garden here. Adrian's eyes rested upon the weathered stone. "Years ago." "What happened to it?" He answered without looking away. "People stopped caring for it after Eleanor died." Clara turned once more toward the lonely winter rose resting in his hands. A bloom preserved by strangers while an entire memorial had disappeared beneath snow. The thought carried unexpected sadness. They returned to the carriage, and the journey resumed beneath a sky now crowded with stars. Near midnight the familiar silhouette of Blackthorne Manor emerged above the cliffs, every window glowing warmly against the dark sea beyond. Mrs. Holloway waited inside the entrance hall despite the late hour, relief softening her composed expression the moment she saw them safely home. Clara thanked the servants before quietly slipping away toward the greenhouse with the silver key hidden inside her cloak. Adrian noticed immediately and followed without question. Frost covered the glass roof while lantern light illuminated rows of sleeping herbs and winter flowers resting peacefully beneath linen cloths. At the far end of the greenhouse stood an old cedar cabinet Clara had always assumed stored ordinary tools. She inserted the silver key. The lock opened with surprising ease. Inside rested carefully folded gardening gloves, pressed flowers tied with blue ribbon, and a narrow wooden box carved with tiny roses along its lid. Clara lifted the box onto the work table and slowly opened it. There was no jewelry. No money. Only dozens of folded letters arranged in perfect order and addressed in the same graceful handwriting. To whoever finds kindness before fear. Clara reached for the first letter while Adrian quietly lit another lantern beside her. She unfolded the aged paper and began reading aloud. The words were simple. If you are holding this, it means someone finally looked where flowers grow instead of where society points. Halfway through the page the handwriting stopped abruptly. The lower corner had been torn away, leaving the final sentence forever unfinished. Beneath the missing section, Pressed gently into the paper rested one last perfect white winter rose. Lantern light trembled softly against the greenhouse glass while snow drifted beyond the windows, transforming Blackthorne Manor into a quiet island surrounded by white silence. Clara remained standing beside the cedar table with Eleanor's unfinished letter resting carefully between her fingers. The missing corner seemed almost more important than the words that remained, as though absence itself had become another language waiting to be understood. Adrian unfolded several additional letters from the wooden box with remarkable care. Every page carried the same graceful handwriting and the same gentle attention to ordinary moments. Eleanor wrote about herbs recovering after harsh winters, children laughing while planting bulbs in the village garden, and elderly widows who insisted on bringing homemade bread whenever flowers bloomed earlier than expected. Nothing resembled scandal. Nothing resembled the mysterious woman London continued discussing with endless fascination. Clara picked up another folded page tied with faded blue ribbon and read quietly. If kindness ever becomes suspicious, continue being kind anyway. People who fear generosity usually fear what it reveals about themselves. She looked toward Adrian. She sounds hopeful. He nodded slowly. She always believed small things mattered. Clara smiled faintly. Then London never knew her at all. Neither noticed Mrs. Holloway entering until she paused respectfully near the greenhouse door. The housekeeper held a sealed envelope against her apron with unusual hesitation. "Your Grace, I apologize for disturbing you, but one of the night gardeners asked that this be delivered immediately." Adrian accepted the envelope before Clara could reach it. The seal carried no family crest. Instead it displayed the familiar pressed white winter rose. Inside rested only a single folded note and a small brass token engraved with the outline of a greenhouse. Adrian unfolded the paper beneath the lantern. "Meet the man who planted the first roses. Sunrise. South Cliffs. Come quietly." Clara watched his expression remain perfectly composed. "Another invitation?" He handed her the note. "Another choice." Morning arrived beneath pale blue skies cleared by the night snowfall. The sea stretched endlessly beyond the cliffs, reflecting winter sunlight like polished silver while waves rolled gently against dark stone below. Clara and Adrian followed a narrow path leading south from the manor, accompanied only by distant seabirds and the crisp sound of boots crossing frozen ground. Frost-covered wild grass bending toward the water, and rows of forgotten rose bushes appeared gradually along the edge of the cliffside, their branches bare yet carefully trimmed by hands that still believed spring would return. An elderly man knelt beside them wearing a heavy brown coat faded by countless winters. His silver hair escaped beneath a wool cap, and thick gardening gloves covered hands marked by decades of patient work rather than wealth. He looked up before they reached him. "Your Grace." Adrian recognized him immediately. "Thomas." The old gardener smiled gently. "It has been too long." Clara noticed there was no fear between them. Only quiet regret shared by people who had survived different versions of the same memory. Thomas removed one glove and carefully brushed snow away from a small stone marker hidden beneath rose branches. Eleanor planted these with village children. The inscription had almost disappeared beneath moss. Clara knelt beside him without hesitation. "We found her letters." The old gardener nodded as though he had expected nothing less. Then the greenhouse finally opened again. Adrian looked toward the endless sea. "You left Blackthorne without explanation." Thomas remained silent for several moments before answering. "Because staying would have forced honest people to choose between loyalty and comfort." Clara studied the old man's weathered face. "Did Eleanor trust you?" A warm smile appeared beneath his white beard. "She trusted anyone willing to kneel in the dirt." He reached inside his coat and removed a narrow leather pouch tied with blue cord. From it he carefully unfolded several receipts written years before in fading ink. They listed purchases of rare herbs, soil, and winter roses for village gardens funded entirely by Eleanor Blackthorne. At the bottom of every page appeared one additional signature. Lady Harrington Foundation. Clara looked from one document to another. They worked together. Thomas nodded. "At first." Adrian finally turned toward him. What changed? The old gardener gazed across the sea where gulls circled above distant waves. Intentions. He explained that Eleanor believed charity should remain anonymous because dignity mattered as much as assistance. Lady Harrington believed generosity deserved public recognition and influence. Their disagreements grew quietly over several years, never through shouting, always through careful conversations hidden beneath perfect manners. Thomas reached into the pouch again and produced a folded ledger page unlike the others. Several payment entries had been crossed out with dark ink. Beside one cancellation, Eleanor had written a single sentence. Flowers cannot grow where kindness becomes currency. Clara felt unexpected sadness settle inside her chest. Thomas looked at her kindly. She never disliked Lady Harrington. She simply stopped trusting ambition dressed as compassion. Adrian accepted the ledger carefully. Why keep this hidden? The old gardener's eyes drifted toward the cliffs. Because truth without proof becomes gossip. Eleanor hated gossip. A familiar voice interrupted the peaceful morning. Then perhaps today deserves proof instead. They turned together to find Lord Ashford walking slowly along the path carrying a polished walking stick. He greeted Thomas like an old friend before reaching into his coat and removing a sealed packet tied with dark blue ribbon. Lady Beatrice asked me to deliver this personally. Adrian accepted the packet while Clara noticed Thomas quietly lower his eyes. Inside rested copies of estate correspondence preserved for more than a decade. Most contained ordinary discussions regarding village projects and greenhouse repairs until one letter captured Clara's attention. It had been written by Eleanor only weeks before her final illness. If anything should happen to me, please continue the children's garden without ceremony. Do not allow grief to become another public performance. Clara looked up slowly. She expected something. Thomas shook his head. No. She expected people to behave as they always had. Silence settled once again while waves rose and fell beneath the cliffs. Suddenly Anna appeared at the far end of the path, running only enough to suggest urgency without panic. Mrs. Holloway followed at a steadier pace. The young maid stopped a few feet away, catching her breath with visible excitement. Your Grace. Clara stepped forward. What is it? Anna held out a folded paper she had been clutching tightly in both hands. A gentleman left this at the kitchen door before sunrise. He said it belonged with the flowers. Clara unfolded the page. Unlike every anonymous note before, this one contained not a warning but a simple list of dates followed by amounts of money transferred between charitable accounts. At the bottom appeared a final line written in unmistakable familiar script. Follow the payments and you will find the missing pages. Adrian studied the document carefully before his attention stopped upon one repeated entry appearing every winter for 6 consecutive years. Recipient: Ashbourne Gardens Restoration Committee. Thomas looked over his shoulder and quietly exhaled. That committee never existed. Clara raised her eyes toward the old gardener. Then where did the money go? Thomas answered with calm certainty that carried the weight of long silence. That is the question Eleanor spent her final month trying to answer. Adrian folded the document carefully and slipped it beside the ledger inside his coat. He looked first toward Clara and then toward the endless rows of sleeping roses stretching along the cliffs. We have enough suspicion. Clara nodded. Now we need evidence. Thomas reached down and gently covered the roots of a young rose bush with fresh soil before standing once more. Then start where Eleanor always started. Clara looked around the quiet memorial garden. With flowers. The old gardener smiled toward the first pale sunlight touching the sea. No. His gaze shifted toward Blackthorne Manor rising above the cliffs behind them. With the people who kept them alive when everyone else stopped looking. A quiet rain arrived before dawn and settled over Blackthorne Manor with the gentle persistence of memory, washing frost from stone paths and leaving every rose branch covered with tiny drops that reflected the first pale light of morning. Clara stood beneath the greenhouse roof watching water gather along the glass before sliding slowly toward the earth where Eleanor's flowers waited patiently for spring. Thomas's final words remained with her through the night. Start with the people who kept them alive when everyone else stopped looking. She turned as Mrs. Holloway entered carrying a simple leather ledger rescued from an old storage cabinet discovered beneath the servants' staircase only hours earlier. The housekeeper placed it carefully upon the wooden table beside the pressed flowers and folded letters. Mrs. Patterson remembered this belonged to the former gardening staff, she explained quietly. Clara opened the worn cover and immediately found pages filled with neat columns recording seed deliveries, greenhouse repairs, and names of villagers hired during difficult winters. Most entries appeared ordinary until she reached the final section written in different handwriting. Instead of expenses, someone had listed names followed by short observations. Mrs. Elwood. Bring soup to widows without asking for thanks. Samuel Pike. Repairs children's fences after sunset. Anna Collins. Plants bulbs outside the school every March. Clara smiled softly. These are not accounts. Adrian stepped beside her and studied the page. No. She turned another leaf. More names appeared beside acts of unnoticed kindness. Nothing measured money. Everything measured character. At the bottom Eleanor had written one quiet sentence. Trust grows where no audience is waiting. Mrs. Holloway looked toward the greenhouse windows where several gardeners had already begun trimming damaged branches after the rain. She believed good people revealed themselves through ordinary habits. Clara closed the ledger gently. Then we should speak with them. By mid-morning the greenhouse had become an unlikely gathering place. Gardeners, kitchen maids, stable hands, and elderly villagers accepted tea while winter sunlight slowly returned through clearing clouds. No one understood exactly why the Duchess wished to hear stories about flowers planted 10 years earlier, yet one by one they shared memories that had survived long after official records disappeared. Mrs. Elwood remembered Eleanor insisting every orphan leave the greenhouse carrying something alive because hope needed roots as much as children did. Samuel Pike recalled delivering wooden benches to the memorial garden without accepting payment because Eleanor had repaired his daughter's broken doll herself. Anna Collins, now a young school teacher rather than the shy girl Eleanor had once encouraged, smiled while holding a tiny clay pot filled with rosemary. She always said gardens belong to people who stay after celebrations end. Clara listened more than she spoke. Patterns slowly emerged from simple recollections. Every project connected villages, gardeners, widows, or children. Every donation quietly improved lives without attracting society's attention. Lord Ashford arrived shortly before noon carrying another bundle of preserved correspondence recovered from his late wife's private writing desk. Margaret saved everything, he explained with affectionate embarrassment. She believed paper remembered what people forgot. Together they sorted letters across long greenhouse tables until one envelope immediately caught Adrian's attention. It had never been opened. The seal belonged to the Lady Harrington Foundation. Clara carefully unfolded the single page inside. Lady Harrington thanked Eleanor for declining public recognition of their charitable partnership and expressed admiration for her preference for anonymity. At first glance the letter appeared perfectly gracious. Then Clara noticed a second sheet hidden beneath it. The paper contained a draft never sent. Eleanor had crossed out several lines before beginning again. The unfinished paragraph remained completely readable. Kindness offered in exchange for influence ceases to be kindness. I cannot continue supporting projects whose first purpose is reputation rather than relief. Clara looked slowly toward Adrian. She was ending the partnership. Lord Ashford nodded thoughtfully. Margaret once mentioned Eleanor seemed unusually disappointed after meeting Lady Harrington that winter. Before anyone could continue, Mrs. Patterson entered carrying a wooden box recently discovered inside the old gardener's cottage near the South Cliffs. Thomas asked me to bring this. The box contained dozens of small envelopes labeled only by year. Inside each rested receipts matching the mysterious payments Clara and Adrian had already found. But now another detail became unmistakable. Every cancelled amount corresponded exactly to money later redirected toward non-existent restoration committees connected to Ashbourne House. Samuel Pike leaned closer while adjusting his spectacles. I delivered stone benches to the memorial garden that year. He frowned gently. No restoration crew ever arrived. Anna Collins searched another envelope and quietly gasped. The school roof was repaired by villagers because promised funds never came. Conversation slowly faded as realization settled over the greenhouse. No one accused anyone. No voices rose. They simply looked at years of ordinary generosity quietly replacing money that official records claimed had already been spent elsewhere. Adrian arranged every receipt into careful order across the table. This is no longer rumor. Clara nodded. It is history. Mrs. Holloway placed one final folded paper beside the growing collection. This was hidden beneath the ledger cover. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Eleanor. If these records are ever needed, please remember that exposing pride is less important than protecting people who depend upon charity. Clara read the sentence twice before lowering the page. She understood then why Eleanor had never created public confrontation. She had tried to preserve dignity even for those who disappointed her. Rain clouds finally parted completely, allowing bright winter sunlight to fill the greenhouse until every pane of glass shimmered above rows of sleeping roses. Adrian looked across the gathered servants and villagers who had unknowingly preserved pieces of truth simply by continuing quiet acts of care year after year. He noticed Clara thanking each person individually, remembering names exactly as Eleanor once had. Mrs. Elwood left carrying fresh herbs. Samuel Pike promised to restore the forgotten memorial bench before spring. Anna Collins volunteered her students to replant the cliffside roses. No speeches were given. No announcements were made. Yet something larger than evidence had quietly returned to Blackthorne Manor. Trust. As the afternoon faded into soft golden light, Clara and Adrian walked through the greenhouse alone, the collected receipts, letters, and ledgers safely stored inside the cedar cabinet once more. She stopped beside the oldest winter rose just beginning to reveal a single pale bud. Do you think Eleanor expected someone to find all of this? Adrian considered the question while watching sunlight warm the fragile bloom. I think she expected kindness to outlive misunderstanding. Clara reached toward the unopened flower without touching it. And do you? He looked at her for a long moment before answering with a quiet honesty that carried none of his usual distance. I did not. She turned toward him. What changed? A faint smile softened the reserve that had guarded him for years. You kept believing people deserved to be understood even after they judged you. The words settled gently between them while rainwater continued falling from greenhouse glass in slow bright drops. Clara lowered her eyes, unexpectedly moved by the simplicity of his answer. Neither noticed Anna hurrying toward the greenhouse until she appeared at the entrance holding a neatly folded cream envelope against her coat. She was smiling rather than frightened. Your Grace, she called softly, a messenger delivered this from Lady Beatrice. Clara accepted the envelope and opened it beside the roses. Inside rested only a single invitation written in elegant script. Tomorrow afternoon. Blackthorne Library. Bring every letter you have found. One final witness has decided silence is no longer kindness. Adrian read the note over her shoulder before his attention stopped on the signature beneath it. Lady Beatrice Somerville had added only 6 handwritten words below her name. She remembers everything that Eleanor forgot to hide. The library had never seemed so alive. Morning sunlight poured through towering windows and settled across long oak tables where bundles of letters, faded ledgers, pressed flowers, and carefully folded receipts rested in perfect order, transforming a room built for quiet reading into a place where forgotten lives slowly found their voices again. Outside, winter clouds drifted above the cliffs without urgency while servants moved through Blackthorne Manor with unusual anticipation, each person somehow aware that something long buried had begun returning to the surface. Clara arrived carrying Eleanor's wooden box against her chest as though protecting something far more delicate than paper. Adrian followed with the journals recovered from the hidden passage, placing them beside the greenhouse records with deliberate care. Mrs. Holloway arranged fresh tea while Lord Ashford stood near the fireplace reading the first pages of Eleanor's private reflections for the second time. No one hurried. Truth deserved patience. Shortly after noon the front doors opened, and Lady Beatrice entered with a calm dignity that seemed untouched by weather, gossip, or age. Beside her walked a woman Clara had never seen before. She appeared to be in her late 60s, dressed in simple dark grey wool with neatly pinned silver hair and gentle eyes that carried equal measures of kindness and sorrow. She held no jewelry except a narrow gold wedding band polished by decades of quiet use. Lady Beatrice introduced her softly. "This is Margaret Ellis. She served as Eleanor's personal secretary for 7 years." Silence settled naturally across the room. Margaret looked toward the journals resting on the table before lowering her gaze. "I never imagined I would see them again." Clara stepped forward first. "Thank you for coming." The older woman smiled faintly. "Lady Beatrice told me the greenhouse was open again." Something in her voice suggested that fact mattered more than anything else. They gathered around the largest table while winter light brightened the faded blue ribbons tying Eleanor's letters together. Margaret reached carefully toward one journal and rested her fingertips against the worn leather cover without opening it. She always wrote after visiting the gardens. Clara listened quietly. "What was she like?" Margaret answered without hesitation. She remembered birthdays no one else noticed. She carried seeds in her pockets because she never believed a journey should end without planting something. Lord Ashford smiled to himself. "That sounds exactly like Margaret, my wife." They spent entire afternoons arguing over roses. The secretary laughed softly. They disagreed about colors every spring. Even Adrian's expression relaxed slightly. The room slowly filled not with mystery but with memory. Clara realized every person who had truly known Eleanor described kindness before tragedy. Lady Beatrice unfolded a thin packet tied with ivory ribbon and placed it beside the journals. "These belong to Margaret. She has kept them private for 10 years. Inside rested handwritten copies of correspondence Eleanor had dictated but never officially sent. Most concerned orphanages, village schools, and greenhouse donations until Margaret stopped at one particular letter. This one matters." Clara leaned closer. The unfinished draft was addressed to Lady Harrington. Eleanor thanked her for years of shared charitable work but politely explained that future donations would be administered directly through local communities rather than social committees. The language remained respectful from beginning to end. At the bottom Eleanor had added one final handwritten sentence separate from the formal text. "Kindness should never become a performance that leaves hungry people applauding instead of eating." Margaret folded the page again. She never mailed it. Adrian looked toward her. "Why not?" The secretary hesitated for the first time. Because the following morning she received a visitor. Every person in the library became still. Clara spoke gently. "Who came?" Margaret answered with complete certainty. "Lady Harrington." No accusation accompanied the statement. Only memory. Lady Beatrice quietly poured another cup of tea before asking the question everyone carried silently. "Did you hear their conversation?" Margaret nodded. "Only the beginning." She closed her eyes briefly, searching through years rather than pages. Eleanor said she wanted every future donation recorded publicly so villages could verify where money actually went. Lord Ashford slowly removed his spectacles. "Transparency." Margaret nodded. Lady Harrington believed wealthy families deserved discretion. Clara looked toward the neatly arranged receipts spread across the table. And Eleanor disagreed. "Yes." Mrs. Holloway entered quietly carrying another tray and stopped when she noticed everyone's attention focused upon Margaret. The housekeeper placed fresh tea beside the secretary with gentle respect. "You should continue while the tea is warm." Margaret smiled gratefully before reaching into her satchel. From inside she removed a small notebook bound in pale blue cloth. "I almost destroyed this many times." Clara accepted it carefully. The notebook contained appointment schedules, flower deliveries, and reminders written by Margaret herself. One page immediately captured Adrian's attention. 3 meetings had been listed during Eleanor's final week. Village school. Greenhouse committee. Lady Harrington. Beside the final appointment Margaret had written only 2 words in tiny script. "Bring ledger." Clara looked up slowly. Which ledger? Margaret pointed toward the greenhouse records already spread across the table. The one containing every charitable payment. Lord Ashford quietly compared dates. They matched perfectly. Eleanor had intended to bring documented accounts to her meeting. Clara felt understanding arrive piece by piece rather than all at once. She wanted every donation verified. Margaret nodded. She believed honesty protected everyone. Adrian remained silent for so long that Clara finally looked toward him. He had opened one of Eleanor's journals to a page filled with simple observations about the manor staff. Beneath a sketch of winter herbs, Eleanor had written another sentence that seemed almost painfully ordinary. Adrian remembered every gardener's name today. I think loneliness becomes gentler when someone notices who is still here. He closed the journal carefully. Clara watched the quiet change in his eyes. The reserve that had protected him for years no longer resembled strength. It resembled grief finally allowed to breathe. She stepped beside him without speaking. Their hands rested near one another on the polished table. Neither reached deliberately. Yet after a moment Adrian's fingers moved just enough for the edges of their gloves to touch. Nothing more. Nothing less. The contact remained unnoticed by everyone except Lady Beatrice, who lowered her eyes with a faint smile before returning to the documents. Margaret continued sorting papers until one folded envelope slipped unexpectedly from the blue notebook and drifted onto the table. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Eleanor. Across the front she had written only one instruction. Open only when someone chooses truth over reputation. Clara carefully unfolded the single page inside. The message contained no accusation and no confession. Only quiet gratitude. If you are reading this, it means Blackthorne has become a home again instead of a monument. Please forgive everyone who was too afraid to ask simple questions. Fear grows quickly in beautiful houses. Kindness requires gardeners. Clara finished reading aloud while complete silence settled across the library. Even the fireplace seemed quieter. Margaret wiped away one peaceful tear and smiled through it. She always believed people could become better. Lord Ashford looked toward the windows where pale sunlight warmed the snow outside. Perhaps she was right. Before anyone answered, the front bell echoed gently through the manor. A footman entered carrying a sealed cream envelope delivered only moments earlier by a messenger from London. He handed it directly to Adrian. The Duke broke the seal and unfolded the elegant invitation inside. His expression remained composed until he reached the final line. Clara looked at him quietly. What is it? Adrian passed her the page. Lady Harrington requested the honour of hosting a public gathering at Ashbourne House the following evening to celebrate 10 years of charitable service to the counties surrounding Blackthorne and invited their graces to attend as guests of distinction. Beneath the formal invitation another sentence had been added in graceful handwriting known to all of them by now. Some flowers bloom only when every window is opened. Lady Beatrice looked from the invitation to the rows of journals and ledgers covering the library tables. Then she spoke with calm certainty. Tomorrow London will finally hear the story Eleanor tried to leave behind. Morning sunlight transformed Ashbourne House into a palace of crystal and pale gold, spilling through enormous windows and reflecting across polished marble until every guest seemed wrapped in quiet brilliance rather than ordinary light. White winter roses filled silver vases placed between towering columns, their delicate fragrance drifting through elegant halls where London's most influential families gathered beneath painted ceilings that had witnessed generations of whispered alliances and forgotten promises. Servants moved gracefully among conversations carrying tea, warm bread, and carefully arranged flowers while musicians tuned gentle strings in preparation for another celebration devoted to charity and reputation. Clara stepped from the Blackthorne carriage wearing the same deep blue gown she had chosen days before, refusing every suggestion that brighter colors or heavier jewels might impress society more effectively. Mrs. Holloway had simply smiled while fastening a single pearl at her collar and quietly observed that dignity required very little decoration. Adrian offered his hand as naturally as breathing, and together they crossed the marble entrance where conversation softened into respectful silence instead of curious speculation. The difference was almost invisible, yet Clara felt it immediately. People were no longer looking for scandal. They were waiting for truth. Lady Harrington welcomed guests beneath an arch of white roses with flawless composure, her emerald silk gown reflecting morning light like polished glass. Nothing in her posture suggested concern. She greeted Clara with the same practiced elegance she had displayed from the beginning. "Your Grace, I am delighted you accepted my invitation." Clara returned the courtesy with quiet warmth. "Thank you for including Blackthorne in today's celebration." Lady Harrington glanced briefly toward Adrian before smiling again. "Charity deserves unity." Adrian answered calmly. "So does honesty." For the first time a nearly imperceptible pause appeared before Lady Harrington responded. "Fortunately they often travel together." She moved gracefully toward newly arrived guests, leaving behind only the faint fragrance of winter roses and polished confidence. Lord Ashford joined Clara and Adrian almost immediately, carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. Lady Beatrice followed moments later with Margaret Ellis beside her, while Thomas arrived through the side entrance wearing his simplest brown coat despite repeated encouragement to borrow something finer. Clara noticed that he seemed entirely comfortable among marble columns and aristocratic titles because years spent tending gardens had already taught him which things truly mattered. The ballroom gradually filled until conversations blended into a warm hum of expectation. At precisely noon Lady Harrington stepped onto the raised platform prepared for welcoming remarks. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead while every chair turned toward her. She spoke with polished sincerity about generosity, community, and 10 years of charitable work connecting noble houses with villages across the county. Applause followed naturally. Several respected families nodded in approval. Then Lady Harrington extended one graceful hand toward Clara. "Today I would also like to recognize the Duchess of Blackthorne, whose recent interest in community gardens reminds us that kindness continues across generations." Hundreds of eyes shifted toward Clara. She stood calmly, feeling neither invisible nor overwhelmed. Adrian looked at her once, offering the same silent choice he always had. She stepped forward. "Thank you," she began softly, her voice carrying through the ballroom with surprising ease. "I have spent the past weeks discovering flowers planted long before I arrived at Blackthorne Manor." Gentle smiles appeared among the audience. Clara continued. "I also discovered letters, journals, and ledgers written by people who believed charity should be measured not by applause but by lives quietly improved." Lady Beatrice rose from her seat without haste. Lord Ashford opened the leather portfolio. Margaret placed Eleanor's blue notebook upon a nearby table. Thomas unfolded faded receipts with steady hands weathered by decades of gardening. None of it resembled accusation. It resembled remembrance. Clara lifted one letter written in Eleanor's familiar graceful hand. She once wrote that kindness offered in exchange for influence ceases to be kindness. Absolute silence settled across the ballroom. Clara continued reading passages describing village schools, widows receiving food without publicity, memorial gardens built through anonymous gifts, and children carrying home flowers instead of fear. Margaret quietly presented appointment notes. Lord Ashford displayed preserved correspondence. Thomas identified restoration payments connected to projects that had never existed. Every document matched another. Every date supported the next. No raised voices interrupted the unfolding history because there was nothing dramatic about ordinary truth patiently preserved by ordinary people. Lady Harrington listened without moving, her expression remaining composed even as understanding spread through the room. Finally she stepped away from the platform and walked toward the table where Eleanor's journals rested beneath winter roses. She looked at the familiar handwriting for a long moment before speaking with remarkable calm. Eleanor believed the world could be gentler than ambition allowed. No one interrupted. She touched one faded receipt lightly with her fingertips. She challenged every committee that preferred appearances over accountability. Her eyes lifted toward Clara. "Including mine." The admission carried no bitterness. Only quiet acceptance. Lady Harrington turned toward the assembled guests. "Many projects associated with my foundation were administered through layers of committees and recommendations. I accepted reports instead of visiting villages myself. I accepted praise instead of asking difficult questions. That failure belongs to me. The ballroom remained completely still. Clara saw surprise on nearly every face. Lady Harrington continued. The missing funds uncovered today will be restored in full. Independent records will be open to every parish involved. The memorial gardens Eleanor began will also be rebuilt under local direction rather than social committees. Thomas lowered his eyes with peaceful relief. Margaret quietly closed Eleanor's notebook. Lady Beatrice smiled almost invisibly. Then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Elwood, who had been invited quietly by Clara, stood from the back row holding a small basket of winter herbs. Lady Eleanor never cared who received credit, she said gently. She only wanted the roses to bloom. Samuel Pike stood beside her. They still can. Anna Collins added softly, our students already volunteered. One by one villagers, servants, and guests began sharing simple promises instead of accusations. Benches would be repaired. School gardens replanted. Greenhouses reopened. Orphanages supplied before winter ended. The atmosphere transformed almost imperceptibly from suspicion into cooperation. Clara realized Eleanor's greatest argument had finally succeeded without requiring confrontation. Kindness had simply gathered enough witnesses. Adrian looked toward Clara while applause rose naturally through the ballroom, not for titles or speeches but for people willing to continue ordinary acts of care. He spoke so quietly that only she could hear. You changed this room. Clara shook her head gently. No. Her eyes rested upon Eleanor's letters surrounded by villagers and aristocrats speaking together for the first time. She planted it long ago. Adrian's reserved expression softened into unmistakable warmth. Without ceremony or performance, he reached for her hand before everyone present and held it with quiet certainty. No whispers followed. No speculation spread through the ballroom. The gesture felt as natural as sunlight across greenhouse glass. Lady Beatrice watched from her chair with contented eyes while Thomas accepted a packet of new rose seeds from Anna Collins, smiling like a man finally allowed to begin spring after a very long winter. Outside, beyond the marble steps of Ashbourne House, snow melted slowly beneath afternoon light, revealing dark earth waiting patiently beneath. Inside, the white winter roses seemed brighter than before, and for the first time in many years no one looked at Clara as the mysterious Duchess of Blackthorne or the shadow of another woman. They looked at her as someone who had quietly chosen understanding over fear and had reminded an entire room that the strongest gardens were always grown together. Spring arrived quietly at Blackthorne Manor, not with dramatic warmth or sudden blossoms but through small changes that only patient people seemed to notice. The sea beyond the cliffs reflected deeper shades of blue each morning. Birds returned to the old stone walls carrying twigs between their beaks. Tiny green shoots pushed carefully through dark earth beside paths that had spent months hidden beneath snow. Clara walked through the greenhouse just after sunrise carrying a wicker basket filled with young herbs while sunlight filtered through newly cleaned glass and covered every row of roses with gentle gold. The gardeners greeted her without ceremony because kindness had become part of the manor's ordinary rhythm rather than an unusual event worthy of attention. Thomas knelt beside a long bed of white winter roses, guiding village children as they planted fresh seedlings with the same steady patience he had once offered Eleanor. Anna Collins arrived each Thursday with her students, who insisted every flower deserved its own name before it belonged in the ground. Mrs. Elwood brought warm bread still wrapped in linen cloth. Samuel Pike repaired benches beneath the cliffs while laughing with stable boys who measured success by crooked nails and muddy boots instead of perfection. Nothing about the mornings appeared remarkable, yet Blackthorne Manor no longer felt like a monument preserving silence. It felt like a home remembering how to breathe. The library changed as well. Eleanor's journals no longer remained hidden behind secret passages or locked cabinets. Clara placed them inside a glass case near the eastern windows where sunlight rested upon the faded blue covers every afternoon. Beside them stood a simple wooden sign carved by Samuel Pike. The Blackthorne Garden Collection. For anyone who believes kindness deserves records too. Visitors from neighboring villages occasionally arrived carrying flowers, stories, or handwritten memories they wished to add to the growing archive. Lord Ashford donated Margaret's preserved correspondence. Lady Beatrice sent a walking cane carved with tiny roses after deciding it belonged in the collection more than in her own hallway. Even Lady Harrington contributed restored financial records and quietly attended the reopening of the memorial gardens without requesting recognition. Some newspapers attempted to transform the events into society spectacle, but London quickly discovered a disappointing truth for gossip writers. No scandal remained. Only cooperation. Headlines gradually changed. The Duchess who reopened Blackthorne Gardens. Village children restore Eleanor's memorial roses. Charity ledgers opened to every parish. Clara smiled each time Mrs. Holloway delivered fresh editions because the articles rarely mentioned titles anymore. They mentioned gardeners, school teachers, widows, volunteers. Adrian noticed the change one peaceful afternoon while standing beside the greenhouse entrance watching Clara help two young sisters untangle climbing roses that had wrapped themselves around an old iron archway. The girls spoke so quickly that their stories became impossible to follow, yet Clara listened to every sentence as though each deserved complete attention. Thomas approached quietly carrying a watering can polished smooth by decades of use. "She reminds me of Eleanor," the old gardener said softly. Adrian looked toward the children laughing beneath fresh blossoms before answering. "She reminds me of herself." Thomas smiled without surprise. "That is even better." Weeks later Blackthorne Manor opened its gates for the first annual Community Garden Day, an idea suggested by Anna Collins and immediately embraced by everyone else. Families arrived carrying baskets of seeds instead of invitations. Musicians played beneath old oak trees while children painted flower pots with impossible colors. Lord Ashford judged the baking table and somehow declared 6 different pies equally deserving of first place. Mrs. Patterson supervised tea with military precision before secretly slipping extra cakes to every child who looked hopeful enough. Lady Beatrice spent the afternoon teaching girls how to press flowers inside books, insisting that memory should always have something beautiful to hold. Lady Harrington arrived wearing simple blue wool rather than emerald silk and spent more than an hour kneeling beside village women planting herbs without anyone announcing her presence. When she finished, she quietly handed Clara a folded note. It contained only one sentence. Eleanor would have approved of muddy shoes. Clara laughed softly before slipping the paper into her pocket beside pressed rosemary. As evening settled across the cliffs, lanterns illuminated winding paths through gardens now filled with early roses, lavender, and climbing ivy. The sea carried the last light of day across calm water while families slowly returned home with seedlings wrapped carefully in cloth. Clara remained near the oldest rosebush where the first white bloom of the season had finally opened. Adrian found her there exactly as he always seemed to do, not because they arranged meetings but because shared silence had quietly become its own destination. They stood together without speaking until the wind carried distant laughter from the manor. Clara looked toward the greenhouse glowing warmly against the darkening sky. "Do you think people will remember Eleanor differently now?" Adrian considered the question while watching children chase fireflies near the memorial path. "Yes." "Why?" He turned toward her with the calm honesty she had come to trust above every polished speech in London. "Because they finally met the people she changed." Clara rested one hand lightly against the old stone wall warmed by the day's sun. "And what about us?" Adrian remained silent long enough that she wondered whether the question would simply join all the others carried away by sea wind. Instead he reached into his coat and removed a small folded page from one of Eleanor's journals. It contained a sentence they had both read many times but somehow understood differently now. "Loneliness becomes gentler when someone notices who is still here." He handed the page to Clara before quietly saying, "You noticed." She looked at the familiar handwriting and then back at him. No orchestra played. No ballroom watched. No society whispered behind lace fans. Only waves touched distant cliffs and roses swayed gently beneath the evening breeze. Clara smiled with peaceful certainty. "I'm still here." Adrian's reserved expression softened completely, carrying none of the distance that had once surrounded him like winter stone. So am I. Their hands found each other naturally, as ordinary and unremarkable as gardeners reaching together for the same watering can. Above them white roses climbed higher across the iron archway, blooming where forgotten branches had once seemed too fragile to survive another season. Long after lanterns faded and the last guests returned home, one small light continued glowing inside the Blackthorne greenhouse beside Eleanor's journals, pressed flowers, and carefully restored ledgers. On the final page of the visitor book, written in Lady Beatrice's elegant hand before she departed, a single sentence waited for whoever opened it next. Some stories are remembered because they end. The best ones are remembered because they quietly teach other people how to begin again.